Hey guys, how is it going? So let me start by, of course, pulling up the official Cam and Cam Pine Point ledger, and let's give out Pine points. So 1,000 Pine points to Kali for being here first. There you go. This makes for riveting entertainment, but we need to get that out of the way. Hold on. Yep, there we go. Then I'm going to actually give 500 Pine points to Greyback, who I think is one of the leading contestant. And of course, 250 to Roman Bessel, who now I believe is in the lead over Digital Noses, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there you go. So Roman, you're on the way to becoming the first ever participant, the first ever viewer to win the 1 million Pine Point prize, which is, of course, a week-long vacation in Las Vegas, all expensive covered, with none other than Pine Creek Duck. But today, I want to defend the inerrancy of Homer. I recently was in some discussions about biblical inerrancy, and I realized how easy it is to defend inerrancy of a text that most normal people would agree is actually fictitious, if not outright fictional in some cases. It's not difficult because what believers usually do is that they, of course, start with the conclusion that the sacred scripture is inerrant, and it's up to you to prove with basically Cartesian certainty that there are historical errors. And the problem is, of course, that history doesn't deal in absolutes but in certainty. It only deals with probabilities. So we can say it's probably the case that a piece of text is not completely historically inerrant. It's probable that there are some historical errors, but for a believer, as long as they can find whatever loophole and whatever ad hoc reasoning to defend basically historical inerrancy, they are going to be happy holding to that inerrancy position, right? As it's very, very difficult to actually show conclusively that a text contains historical errors. I mean, this is why Mormons still exist, right? I mean, Mormons, the Book of Mormon, for example, depicts Native Americans, or I should say the descendants of the Jews, right, riding horses, which we of course know were not native to North America, but there's always rationalization. Right? And I want to actually show you guys how easy it is to come up with these kinds of rationalizations if you are motivated enough, and how basically any text can be defended this way. If you don't care about what's probable and what's plausible, you can always do it. And this is something that Lydia McGrew actually made me think about. You know, she kind of inspired in part this video because she said, I can harmonize harmonize Plutarch, no problem. You know, like Mark Alcona always says that there are these compositional literary devices in the writings of Plutarch, and based on that, we know that they existed, and we can maybe look for them in the Gospels, and that's what accounts for some of the apparent contradictions. To which Lydia McGrew said, "Well, I can harmonize Plutarch, no problem. What are you talking about? There are no compositional devices. It's not that Plutarch is telescoping or condensing or changing, moving events around, changing chronology. You're just not harmonizing it hard enough." And the point is, of course, then you can harmonize any text. And if you actually look at the range of methods that she uses for harmonization to basically defend the idea that we haven't found any historical errors in the Bible, well, then you can do it with everything, right? And I want to show you guys that this is the case by applying the same methodology to the Homeric epics. Because, of course, the Homeric epics are not historically reliable. They are not history, they are myth. And as far as we can tell, they are completely fictional, not fictitious. So, as far as we know, the people that the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, describe never existed. It's not the case that they are based on any actual, historical people, just mythicized or mythologized. There never really was any Priam, Hector, Agamemnon, Achilles, and stuff like that. And of course, there never was any Zeus or anything like that. But there is an apologist living inside my head, and I will now let him loose. And this time it's going to be an apologist for inerrancy of Homer. But before we actually start, there is one thing that we need to kind of go over in order to make this understandable. And it's a little bit of chronology, right? So we need to actually understand the period that we are talking about. So when it comes to ancient history, there are several basic periods that are named after the after the main material that was used to craft tools. There is, of course, the Stone Age, then there is the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and then history proper starts, right? And as some of you might know, at the end of the Bronze Age, there was something that's called the Bronze Age collapse, when civilization, at least in the Mediterranean basin, in especially in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the ancient Near East, basically collapsed. So, if you are fond of reading or watching fiction set in post-apocalyptic dystopias, well, there already has been one, at least one, this kind of apocalyptic collapse, followed by a post-apocalyptic society, and that was at the end of the Bronze Age. And really, like the decline in living conditions, the level of technological development was very sharp. Population declined, the number of settlements declined, some technologies were forgotten and they were only rediscovered in centuries. In Greece, for example, the ability to writing, was lost for centuries. For a while, there were no stone buildings erected in Greece. And later, when Greeks look at remnants from their own Bronze Age civilizations. For example, the palaces that were still around, they didn't disappear; they were just in ruins. Their own technological level was so low that they couldn't understand how people in the past could have ever erected such huge walls and such monuments, and how they could move stones that were so large. So they became convinced that the buildings from the late Bronze Age must have been actually built by giants, by cyclops, right? So that's how much society regressed at the end of the Bronze Age. We don't really know what caused the Bronze Age collapse. It's usually associated with migration of the so-called sea peoples. So the idea is that suddenly, from somewhere, probably from continental Europe, these large amounts of new ethnic groups basically overrun Eastern Mediterranean, and that caused a general collapse of civilization. But that's problematic. And also, the question is what caused the sea people to migrate, So that might not be the ultimate reason. But the point is that there was this collapse, and it's important to bear in mind. And so what we have here is a timeline of roughly this period of time. So the border between the red segment and the gray segment is when the Bronze Age collapse took place. It's dated to roughly 1200 BCE. Sometimes you can see it dated a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later. What's before, so the red segment, is the late Bronze Age, which in Greek area is called Mycenaean period. So Mycenaean, not to be confused with mycelial. And what's important is that the siege of Troy and the fall of Troy is depicted as taking place basically at the end of the Bronze Age, right, around this period of time. So, as a couple of podcasts ago, I basically showed you that pretty much most of Greek mythology actually takes place in a very short period of time, within about three generations, right? And that's this period of time. So, really, the world of Greek mythology, the various characters, is the world of late Bronze Age Greece, of the end of the Mycenaean period. And what follows the Bronze Age collapse is, of course, the Dark Ages. So, in this case, it's the Greek Dark Ages, when, as I mentioned, the level of civilization drastically collapsed. And again, for example, the ability to write was forgotten for several centuries before finally Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet. That's the beginning of the Greek alphabet as we know it. And these Greek Dark Ages lasted for a couple of centuries until roughly the year 800 BCE, which is the start of so-called archaic period. It's, for example, connected with the development of polis, with great Greek colonization, with a social crisis and the crisis of the aristocracy in the Greek world, which led to emergence of archaic Greek tyranids and various other political, social, and economic processes. And after the end of the archaic period, we have the classical period and so on, right? And what's important is that the Homeric epics are usually dated to the beginning of the archaic period or very late Dark Ages, Greek Dark Ages, right? And what's really important, what this diagram, what this visualization is supposed to communicate, is the idea that there is a gap of several centuries between when the story of the Trojan War is set and when the epic itself was composed. So it's not the case that Homer was a contemporary of the fall of Troy. He's not an eyewitness, he's not working with eyewitnesses. He's actually removed by several centuries from the events themselves. And what's even more important than that is that what's between him and the events are centuries of dark ages where the civilization level was very, very low and culture was basically in decline. There was no ability to write. And really, there was this sharp disconnect between late Bronze Age Greek civilization and what emerged later in the Archaic period. There wasn't any political continuation, right? There wasn't any. It's not the case, for example, that some political system survived the Bronze Age collapse in Greece. All of them were gone. All of the dynasties were gone. All of the states were gone. Some of the settlements still existed, but when it comes to organization of society, that was very much different. This is not the case in ancient Near East. Some empires survived, most importantly, for example, Egypt, but some very, very important great powers of the late Bronze Near East completely disappeared and never reappeared again. The Hittite Empire, one of the three largest empires at the end of the Bronze Age, just completely collapsed and disappeared, basically. So yeah, this is very important to understand, right? So when we are talking about the historical reliability of Homer, it's important to realize that this is not given, right? This is not something that we would normally expect because Homer is actually dated from the events that he's narrating by centuries. and they are centuries of deep, deep dark ages. So let's go into it. So I will now put on my pagan apologist hat, and I will show you guys how to defend inerrancy of the Homeric epics. But before I start, I have to give you guys my testimony as a pagan apologist, right? So I started as an atheist, of course, and I've been atheist for most of my life. And if you knew me back then, you would know that I was the most fundamentalist, the most extreme atheist you've ever seen. But then something amazing happened in my life. I noticed that my wife started worshiping at the temple of Apollo, you know, weaving new robes for the statue of Athena, tending to the altars, decorating them for annual festivals. And she asked me even to attend sacrifices at the temple of Apollo. And I went. I then read, of course, Iliad and Odyssey, and I found it completely ridiculous. And I decided that I would actually use all of my political science skills to debunk them, right? So I actually set up to disprove the Homeric epics using my superb political science skills. Because at the time I was a brilliant political scientist. You can say I was one of the top in the country. There was actually one year in which I was the most often cited political scientist by mainstream media in Czech Republic. This is actually true. So here's a collage of my public appearances on TV, and stuff like that. So really, I decided to take all of my great political science skills and apply it to the question of historical reliability of the Homeric epics. And my goal was to disprove them, to show my wife and other believers that what they believe is foolish. My political science skills, such as analyzing various ideological cleavages in interwar Scandinavia, applying various post-structuralist frameworks to regime changes during the Great French Revolution, modeling effects of inter-party candidate nomination processes on party cohesion in subnational legislatures, right? I took all of those extremely relevant skills and I applied them to these historical questions. But after 2 years of intense research, I discovered that I'm not able to do it. And I became convinced. I want to share the good news of the Homeric epics with you. So first of all, we are going to start with some positive evidence and positive arguments in favor of historical reliability of the Homeric epics and why it's just amazing how reliable they are, given this vast gap between when the events took place and when the epics were written, and given that in this time frame there was this massive dark age, right? And then I will go and debunk some of the arguments that are put forward by skeptics against the historical reliability of the epics. So, first of all, one massive piece of evidence for historical inerrancy of the Homeric epic is, of course, the fact that we excavated Troy, right? That's pretty amazing. We actually have the city itself. And this, of course, completely disprove all of the liberal German theologians of the 19th century who considered Ilion, the city of Ilion, to be, or Troy, to be fictitious. It was actually considered to be the myth. But then it was actually vindicated by archaeology. So, what better evidence for historical inerrancy there is than having the city itself, right? And Friedrich Schliemann, the German archaeologist who excavated Troy, was actually guided to find the location by the text itself. So he took the text of the Iliad and he was able to identify various geographical features and find the city. And but by the way, before we go on, I should guys step out of the role and tell you that like everything I'm about to tell you is actually factually true. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to state anything that wouldn't be the case. I'm just going to use the same rhetoric, the same kind of generalization and misinformation that you can sometimes see in the world of apologetics. But I'm not just not going to say anything that would not be factually correct, right? So let's go on. Yeah, and what's amazing is that ancient Greeks actually developed a genealogy of their prehistory, including when various gods were active on Earth, when various heroes were active on Earth, and including, of course, the siege and fall of Troy. We have many writings from the ancient world that give us specific dates for specific events. This is how we can tell when exactly, in which year, the city of Troy fell. And what's amazing is that Schliemann actually discovered the destruction layer corresponding to the siege and fall of Troy. It's, of course, the layer 7a, which is in exactly the right time period, corresponding precisely to the dating of the Greeks, which is amazing because the dating is mostly put together from genealogies. And it just shows you how reliable this historical information is. Then, of course, we have the various details from the Homeric epic confirmed by non-Homeric sources. For example, as I already mentioned, the Hittite Empire, which was one of the largest empires of the late Bronze world, and Hittites wrote massive amounts of documents. They had archives, and some of their documents were actually preserved. So we can read through them, and if we read through them, we actually discover that they attest to various aspects of the Homeric epics. Most importantly, the city of Troy itself, the city of Ilion, is attested in the Hittite archive. It's called Vilusha, which is just the Hittite equivalent for Ilion. And then, of course, it even attests to the Greeks, the opponents. So we actually have both sides of the conflict attested in the Hittite archives. It talks about a group of people or a nation called Achiava, which is just, of course, the Hittite equivalent for the Achaeans. This is the name of the Greeks in the Homeric epics, right? And the Hittite writings even correctly place this land of Achiava to the west of the Hittite empire, which is, of course, exactly where mainland Greece is situated, right? The Hittite Empire was in central and eastern Anatolia, in today's Turkey. So the Greeks would be living to the west of that region, and that's exactly what we find in the Homeric epics. And now another great piece of evidence, and this is really, this is Schliemann's wife. She is actually wearing one of the diadems found in the city of Troy. So again, not only do we have the actual city itself, we have even some of the artifacts. Here again is another amazing piece of evidence for the historical reliability of the Homeric epics, and that's the fact that the Homeric epics give us an accurate depiction of geography and population composition of the late Bronze Age period. How do we know that? Well, for example, in Song 2 of the Iliad, there is a section called the Catalogue of Ships. It's a very long segment where basically it just narrates various peoples and various leaders that participated in the Trojan War and how many ships they contributed to the Greek fleet. It's not narrative. It's like a yellow pages catalog, right? It's just a list of names and numbers of ships. And obviously, it was very difficult for the Greek rhapsodes who sang the Homeric epics to memorize, because really there's nothing to aid your memory. It's just a long list of names and locations. And we can even see that it was difficult for them to memorize because before the start of the catalog of ships, and this is, by the way, the I believe the only place in the Homeric epics, apart from the introduction, where the rhapsode, the singer, actually invokes muses of the goddesses that inspire the poets and that guarantee the historical accuracy. So he basically appeals to them to give him strength so that he's able to get through this very difficult part of the Moem and to recite the entire catalog of ships. Why is the catalog of ships important? Well, because it basically gives us an overview of geography and population distribution in Greece at the end of the Bronze Age during the siege of Troy. And after the catalog of ships, which basically lists the participants on the Greek side, there is the catalog of the Trojans, which essentially does the same thing for the Trojan side. And why is this important for historical accuracy? Well, first of all, because this has been confirmed by archaeology and by other records. So we know that there is preserved an accurate depiction of geography of various settlements and locations, not when Homer wrote, but when the fall of Troy actually took place. And what's completely amazing is that there is absolutely no way for Homer to get this right if the Homeric epics were actually not historically inerrant, and if he was not divinely inspired by the muses. Why is that? Well, because remember that on the timeline, the fall of Troy is here and Homer is here. And what's between them are these Dark Ages. And what happened in the Dark Ages? Well, writing was lost. There was this great turmoil, the great period of discontinuity, when all of these political systems just completely collapsed, like all of the empires, all of the kingdoms in Greece collapsed. But what's most amazing is that there was massive migration, right? I mentioned migration of sea peoples, and in Greece specifically, there is this thing called the Doriac invasion or Dorian invasion. It's the invasion of people from which spoke what later became the Doriac dialect of Greek, who moved from essentially inland Balkans. They swept through mainland Greece. They mostly settled in eastern mainland Greece and southern mainland Greece in Peloponnesos, in Crete, and in the southern Aegean islands. And they actually pushed the previous native population out partially, and this population itself moved. And it, for example, colonized the coast of Asia Minor, right? So when you think about later history, about these important Greek cities in Ionia, which were kind of catalysts and triggers of a lot of important historical events, for example, the Persian Wars, right? The Persian Wars were partially started by these Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor rebelling against the Persian rule. Well, why is it the case that there were Greeks living in Asia Minor in the first place, right? Well, these were descendants of Greeks from mainland who migrated, essentially escaping the Dorian invasion. So as you can see on this map, large numbers of the population essentially moved about 300 to 500 kilometers to the east, right? And what's important is that this took place during the Dark Ages. So in between when the fall of Troy happened and when Homer wrote. So there was this just massive swap, and it completely changed the demography of Greece. some settlements which were very, very important in the late Bronze Age period, when the Odyssey and the Iliad takes place, completely disappeared and they were never resettled. Some settlements still continued, but their importance was greatly diminished, and they are later just a footnote on history if we hear about them at all. In some cases, they don't have any, they don't leave any footprint in the written text. We just know about them from archaeology. And then, of course, there were new locations. Like these newcomers set up new cities. They populated regions differently. So really, the population structure of mainland Greece was different. And of course, there was new population, new Greek population on the coast of Asia Minor. They established new settlements as well that were not there previously. And so what's really amazing, and this is completely impossible unless the Homeric epics were divinely inspired and are historically inerrant, is that what we find in the Homeric is the population composition and the population structure correctly depicting the situation before the Dorian invasion, before this massive population change happened. Although this is completely impossible, this could not happen. Homer would not have any information about that, just from people, because you have to realize that there were these dark ages, right? Writing was lost. All of the archives were lost. All of the written documentation about that was completely gone. So there was absolutely no way for him to know about this. There was no way for him to get it right. You might argue that he had some information, but we would absolutely expect him to make some mistakes. But this is completely impeccable. So again, this correct depiction of geography, of population composition, of distribution of people is absolutely amazing, given this massive demographic change that happened between the fall of Troy and when the Homeric epics were written, especially given that there was this gap of Greek dark ages in between. So that's another amazing evidence. Then we have a number of accidental historical details. For example, the Homeric epics correctly depict Greeks using chariots. So if you've read especially the Iliad, the way how these Greek heroes fight is they put on armor, they get on a chariot with a chariot driver, so they don't actually drive the chariot themselves. They have a dedicated driver who is not a hero, and they actually drive the chariot to battle. Then they dismount it and they fight on foot. Well, what do you know? In the archaic, late Dark Ages and the early Archaic period when Homer wrote, this was no longer the case. At the time, military and army composition, army was dominated by aristocratic cavalry, and there was even the emergence of later heavy infantry, the phalanx, which is of course very famous Greek formation. But chariots were not really used in the Homeric time anymore, but they were used in the late Bronze Age when the Homeric epics are set, around the fall of Troy. And we even excavated remnants of chariots in various locations in Greece in the late Bronze Age, for example, in Pylos. And we have chariots mentioned in written records from the late Bronze Age period, and we are going to talk a little bit about them later. So again, just these incidental details. And if you think about it, Homer would have no way of knowing that chariots were being used in the late Bronze Age period, right? He would just naturally depict the style of combat the same way, what was the case in his own time. But this is not the case. Again, he has this accurate information about the various accidental details of history that he just could not have had unless the Homeric epics were actually divinely inspired by the muses. In Iliad and the Odyssey, the characters don't actually use iron, which is amazing, right? Because again, iron was completely, the usage of iron was completely normal. Iron was widespread in Homer's own time. But again, Homer somehow correctly knew that centuries before, on the other side of this dark age through which no information could have possibly passed, there was no iron being used, right? It was the Bronze Age. But people didn't know that back in Homer's own time, right? So how is it the case that he just correctly depicts people not using iron and only using bronze? That's amazing, right? Now there are of course references to iron, but they are only in so-called Homeric similes, which is basically comparisons. That's a specific literary device where Homer is comparing two things together. Usually a character with something, like something in nature, animal, a god, or something like that. There, of course, iron features, but that's can be explained by the author knowing about iron, and using iron in this literary device. But it's not actually a component of the story. So it's not the case that someone has an iron sword or has an iron shield or something like that. Um, so yeah, this is just an amazing piece of historical verisimilitude that can only be explained by the Homeric epics being inerrant. There is no money in the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? We don't really see any kind of coinage or any currency being used at all. The let's say the wealth is measured mostly in oxen and in like these kinds of domestic animals. You are as wealthy as an aristocrat as how much animals you have, but we don't really have people using money. So this is also historically accurate. Another amazing evidence for inerrancy of the Homeric epics is the fact that names that we have in the Homeric epics match the names that we have attested in the late Bronze Age period. And again, this is really amazing because Homer, writing centuries after the fact, there was no way for him to get these names correct, right? If he knew he's writing fiction, he would just like make up names, right? He wouldn't use names that were appropriate for the time period. And of course, if he was writing a story that was set maybe a couple decades before his own time, maybe he could have somehow got it right. But he's actually writing hundreds of years, a story that's taking place hundreds of years in the past. So, first of all, a lot of the gods are actually attested already in this late Bronze Age period. We actually have some writing from the late Bronze Age period. So let me actually find that. Yeah, this is the chariot that I was talking about. Yeah, so we actually have writings from the late Bronze Age Greece, right? These are two basic sets of texts, essentially, written in two different languages. The script is similar, but the two languages are different. It's the textual, let's say, tradition is called Linear A and Linear B. It's also the name of the script. Linear A is written in an unknown language. It's the language of the population that lived in Greece and in the Aegean before the arrival of the Greeks. And then the Linear B texts are written in a very early form of Greek. What's important is that we haven't actually managed to translate the Linear A texts, so we don't know what it says. But about 70 years ago, so not that long ago, I think it was like in the 50s, something like that, we actually managed to translate the texts written in Linear B script. So we actually know what they say. And these are texts written by the Greeks in late Bronze Age, roughly in the same time period as when the fall of Troy took place. So here's an example. The writing material are clay tablets, which were just left or like on the sun to harden. Most of the texts are, I would say all of the texts actually are just accounting records. They are usually lists of various goods and what to do with them. Because these texts are essentially were written by accountants or by civil servants living in palaces, which were in charge of redistribution of goods in the economy. And of course, in order to do that well, they needed written records. So they just manufactured tablets from clay. They wrote on them various, accounting records, like how much goods were gathered and how to redistribute them. And so this is the content of most of the tablets. But what's very important is that we have some proper names attested on the tablets. And what we very often have are names of gods, names of deities. Because, of course, when you redistribute goods, some of those goods are going to be going towards sacrifices to the gods, right? As all proper pagans do. So a lot of the names of the gods, periods appropriate, are depicted in the Homeric epics. For example, Athena and Poseidon. Some of the gods, which only show up in Greece later, are actually not depicted, like Mithra, for example. And what's amazing is that Dionysus is actually depicted as well. He's attested in these late Bronze Age writings as well, which is very significant because, of course, all of those German liberal theologians of the 19th century all believed that Dionysus is actually a late god. He was introduced very late in the historical period, like much centuries later, essentially, as a new god in Greece. But they were just completely proven wrong when this was translated, because it was actually found out that Dionysus was already worshipped in the late Bronze Age period, and lo and behold, he actually shows up as a deity in the Homeric epics. So that's again amazing. And what's also amazing is that what we have attested in these linear B tablets is the name Achilles. So Achilles, arguably the main hero of the Iliad, we already have him attested in these linear B tablets, right? So yeah, that's just amazing evidence for historical accuracy. What's also very important is that unlike some ancient scriptures where we don't really know who wrote them and we don't really know how the information was transmitted between when the events took place to when they were written, in case of the Homeric epics, we have this safe line of transmission from Homer back to historical times, because they were not transmitted by random people, it's not the case that someone told someone and that person told their wife and that person told their neighbor, and finally after decades or centuries the information was written down, but we actually have no idea where it originates. No, there was this secured, established chain of custody of the Homeric epics, because there actually was a profession which was charged with preserving these epics. The profession was called a rhapsode. So there were rhapsodes, there were professional singers of the Homeric epics who made sure to facilitate this controlled transmission of the Homeric epics. And how do we know that they didn't just change the text, right? Well, the rhapsodes were not just telling these stories for the fun of it. They were actually competing with one another, right? So there were formal competitions between various rhapsodes where the rhapsodes would sing, and then there would be some kind of jury that would just give prize to the best rhapsode. And the way how these competitions were organized was that in order to make sure that every rhapsode faithfully memorized the entire content of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which was again very important, right? Because if the requirement was for the rhapsode to only remember a part of it, they could specialize. So they could train to be really good at singing one specific segment of the poems, But Greeks, of course, because they were very fair, right? They liked fair play. They wanted to make sure that all the rhapsodes compete on a level playing. So they actually made it such that the rhapsodes were required to memorize the content of the entire Iliad and the Odyssey. And how did they do that? Well, the competition was organized so that a rhapsode would start to sing, and then after some unspecified period of time, he would be told to stop, and the next rhapsode in line would be asked to continue singing, starting from the place where the previous rhapsode stopped. So all of the rhapsodes would eventually compose or perform the entire poem, right? And they would just take turns after random passages. And this made sure that every rhapsode knew the entire text because they could be asked could be asked to continue singing from any point. They didn't know in advance when they would be asked, right? So this was the way how to make sure that they would memorize everything, right? And of course, they would not change the text because then again, it wouldn't be a fair competition, right? Everyone had to sing the same thing because if you could change it, well, you could change it to make it easier for you, right? So again, this performance in competition was a key technique for ensuring that the text is preserved accurately and that no alterations were permitted, right? And of course, the greatest evidence for divine inspiration of the Homeric epics are the various fulfilled prophecies. So I won't be able to touch on all of them, but here's one example. This has to do with Aeneas, the great hero who fought on the Trojan side. And in several places, and this is actually very conspicuous, in several places of the Iliad, he is facing a Greek hero in a duel, in a combat, and he's about to be killed. But always he's saved by the gods, as almost as if he was set aside for a greater purpose, for a special destiny, something greater than himself. It's not like these Greek heroes were just dying left and right, slaughtered by the dozens. No, he is always saved by the gods for some reason. And what is the reason? And really, no one else, apart from Paris at one point, is saved this way. What was the reason? Well, actually, Poseidon in Song 20 tells us what the reason is. He tells us of this great prophecy. He says, "Let us snatch him," meaning Aeneas, "from death's jaw. Lest the son of Kronos be angry," that's of course Zeus, "be angry, should Achilles slay him. It is fainted, moreover, that he should escape, and that the race of Dardanos, whom Zeus loved above all the sons born to him of mortal women, shall not perish utterly without seed or sign. For now indeed has Zeus hated the blood of Priam, while Aeneas shall reign over the Trojans, he and his children's children, that shall be born hereafter." So here there is this amazing prophecy which says that Aeneas would actually not be slain in the battle, but he would become a father of great nations. He would rule over the Trojans, and he would set up this future nation. And this nation, above all, would be loved more than any other nation that derives its line, basically, from the gods. And this is exactly what happened. Because, of course, what this prophecy is talking about are the Romans. It's the nation of the Romans that, of course, was fathered by Aeneas, who escaped Troy eventually. And after great many struggles, after visiting the underworld and encountering various obstacles along the way, he landed in Italy. And after fighting war, he established Latium, Alba Longa, And from there, centuries later, the city of Rome was established by Romulus and Remus. So here we have a prophecy, prophesying correctly something centuries before it actually happened. And now you might be thinking, okay, of course, Homer writing at the end of the Dark Ages or the beginning of the Archaic Ages, well, he already knew that that happened, right? So that's kind of a prophecy after the fact. Well, he would have no way of knowing how great the Romans would become, right? When he wrote, the city of Rome probably was not even founded yet. So he had no way of knowing that the Romans really are the nation which is the most beloved by the Zeus or by Jupiter, which is why, of course, Jupiter made them uh, the greatest empire that have ever existed, uh, which exceeded any other nation in piety and in virtue. So here we have an amazing evidence, and that's this prophecy. So just to reiterate, there are great many evidences for the historical reliability, and there I say historical infallibility, inerrancy of the Homeric epics. We have evidence from archaeology. We have evidence from incidental historical details. We have evidence from extra Homeric sources. We have evidence from corresponding names. We have evidence from established control line of transmission. And we even have fulfilled prophecies. So, in the rest of the time, I want to actually debunk some of the objections and some of the supposed historical inconsistencies and historical errors in the Homeric epics. And I just want to show you that all of those problems can be harmonized away if you try enough, try hard enough, and that really this historical inerrancy of the Homeric epics is impeccable. Let me just check the chat. Let's make sure that everything is okay. Yeah, it seems everything is working. Okay, let's go on. So, what do the skeptics say? What are some of the objections against the inerrancy of the Homeric epics, right? Well, first of all, obviously, the Homeric epics contain a lot of supernatural stuff. And a lot of the skeptics want to rule out supernatural events just a priori, right? They will define, for example, miracles as something that never happens. Well, uh, that's just anti supernatural bias, right? So, of course, if you're starting with atheism as your presupposition, there is no way you can ever be convinced that the Homeric epics are inerrant. You need to actually be open minded and you can admit the possibility that there actually are supernatural events still happening in the world today and that people are being miraculously healed even from terminal diseases by the power of Apollo and Asclepius. And if that happens today, then of course that happened thousands of years ago as well. And I was a victim of this anti supernatural bias myself. And during my investigation of the Homeric epics, I had to let go of that presupposition as well. Another obvious objection is that there are no gods on Mount Olympus, right? We actually, not just on Mount Olympus, on Mount Ida in Troas either, because of course in the Homeric epics, Mount Olympus is the most important uh, gathering places and palace of the gods, but there are others. And actually, different gods have different places where they reside. And Mount Olympus is most importantly the assembly place of the gods. And we, of course, reached the top of Mount Olympus, and there are no gods there. Well, of course, the gods are not just going to show up and reveal themselves to us, because that would completely take away our free will. We, of course, need to make the free decision to worship the gods of our own, from our own belief, right? From our own heart, and be convinced by the amazing evidence that I've presented so far, and I will continue to present moving forward. So, of course, we are just not going to walk into the assembly chamber of the gods and, take ambrosia and drink nectar and have a chat with Zeus. That's not how it works, right? Um, then, these skeptics sometimes allege that there are actually historical inconsistencies, inaccuracies, or contradictions in the Homeric epics, but that's actually not the case. Sometimes they say, for example, that the Homeric epics just don't mention writing at all, which is actually massively improbable if they are actually historically inerrant, because, of course, in the late Bronze Age, as we have already shown, there was writing at the time in the Aegean region, right? So Greeks, for example, knew writing, and we even have texts surviving from that period of time. But in Homer's own time, there was no writing. So the fact that writing is not mentioned anywhere in the Iliad or the Odyssey is super suspicious, and it makes it look like it was actually written as a fictitious story in a time when writing was not a thing. So that's why it's not a part of the story. Well, as we all have seen, there are these amazing incidental details that the Homeric epics get right. All the chariots, the names of the gods, no iron, no money, and stuff like that. So this would be at best a piece of evidence that would go against. So on one hand, we would have this lack of writing, but on the other hand, we have all this pile of historically accurate stuff. But what's more important is that this objection from a lack of writing in the Homeric epics actually isn't even true. So if you look at the Homeric epics, we actually do find writing mentioned in the text. So there is a story which characters say it's actually two heroes meet on the battle, and before they fight, they narrate their family history. They basically tell each other who they are. One of them is a descendant of Bellerophon, and when he is narrating the story of Bellerophon, his ancestor, he mentions an episode in which a king tried to assassinate Bellerophon. This is what it says. The king was angered, but shrank from killing Bellerophon, so he sent him to Lycia, bearing baneful signs, written inside a folded tablet and containing much ill against the bearer. So again, here, as you can see, there is clearly evidence of writing already presented in the Homeric epics. What's more, it's exactly the kind of writing material that we have attested from late Bronze Greece, right? Because we have to remember that centuries later, when writing was reintroduced to Greece, the writing material was papyrus. But in late Bronze Age Greece, the writing material were tablets. And what does Elias mention? Tablets. So this is actually completely historically accurate, right? And what's important to realize that these clay tablets were not being used for writing in Homer's own time. So this actually isn't an objection. This actually shows another amazing accidental historical detail that the Iliad got wrong, even though there was absolutely no way for it to get it wrong unless it was really divinely inspired by the muses, right? And it's this idea that it correctly depicts writing on tablets, which is exactly what we have again attested in the archaeological record. Even though when Homer wrote, centuries later, after a period of a dark age, Greeks didn't write, and they certainly didn't write on tablets. So that's just an objection that doesn't go anywhere. Then we have contradictions, alleged contradictions, apparent contradictions in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But for all of them, we can actually find a perfectly plausible harmonization. So, supposedly, in Book 5, the king of the Paphlagonians, Paphlagonians, is actually slayed on the battlefield. And it appears to be the case that in book 13, he is actually alive, mourning the death of his own son. So, supposedly, allegedly, we have a king who's both dead and alive. He was slain, but then he's depicted as living. So, what's happened? Well, first of all, there are several completely plausible harmonizations. And really, the fact that skeptics jump to calling this a contradiction shows that they lack the imagination and they lack the honest effort that you need to put in order to resolve these harmonizations plausibly. So, what are some of the harmonizations on offer? Well, first of all, the obvious answer is that the king was actually raised from the dead. And we know that there are gods that can heal. Apollo comes to mind, Asclepius comes to mind. Really, all of the gods can heal. And they can heal any disease, they can heal any wound, and they can even raise people from the dead. And we again have this attested in the historical record. For example, Asclepius raising various people from the dead. But we don't even have to go that far. If you are a skeptic and you don't like these miracle events, fine. There are completely natural harmonizations that can take care of this contradiction. How about this? Well, they were actually 3 generations of Paphlagonian kings fighting at Troy. There was a king named Pylaemenes, who is the one who was killed in Iliad book Song 5. Then there was his son of the same name, who, after his father was killed, immediately became king, because that's how primogeniture succession works. And this is actually the king who is mourning the death of his son. So you have father, the son, and then the grandfather of the oldest generation, right? The first one was killed, and the oldest is killed, the youngest is killed, and the only one that was left was the son, who is mourning the death of his own son and was the son of the deceased king, right? So completely takes care of that contradiction. There is nothing implausible about it. In fact, and this is true, I have the exact same name as my own father. So we can see that this is happening all the time. This happens all the time. There is nothing implausible about it. So that just takes care of that contradiction. And then there is a second objection against historical inerrancy of the Homeric epic, and that's really the kind of society that the epics depict. Because we know, again, from archaeological findings that, let me actually find some of the pictures that I placed out of order, that the late Bronze Age Greece was a period when civilization was at very high level, technological level. They were these great monumental buildings, most importantly palaces and fortresses, with great many rooms. There is, for example, the floor plan of Nestor's palace in Pelus, which was excavated, dated to late Bronze Age. And we know that society was very the kind of hierarchy, the kind of organization of the society was very advanced, right? So we know that the political systems were very well organized. There was this class of civil servants who knew how to write and who were in charge of organizing the economy. Because, as we already shown, money wasn't the thing. So the way how economy worked was this: there was this kind of redistributed economy where the people who produced, most importantly farmers and craftsmen, would basically allocate some of their product to this palace, and the civil servants would redistribute it mostly to people who performed services. People, for example, who worked in baths and so on, right? So basically anyone who couldn't grow their own food and who couldn't manufacture their own tools and stuff like that. There was this kind of central redistribution system in these palaces. So the hierarchy and the organization in this period was very advanced, and the palaces themselves were apparently just gorgeously decorated. This is a reconstruction of one of the palaces. This is, of course, the Megaron, the kind of central hall with a large fireplace where the king would reside. But the thing is that if we look at the Homeric epics, this is not what we find. There is no evidence of these amazing palaces. There is no evidence of this advanced bureaucracy, of these civil servants, of this infrastructure. This is just not mentioned, right? And when we actually look at the kind of organization of society in the epics, it shows much more primitive, a much more basic, basic polity, right? Basic political system. Something that we find not in the late Bronze Age era when the fall of Troy occurred, but at the end of the Dark Ages when the epics were composed. So we actually see Greeks and Greek kings, nobility, essentially behaving the way how barbarians are normally stereotyped in the ancient world, right? So they are these petty kings surrounded by a small number of elite warriors who are also their friends. They are their peers from aristocratic families. They own land and they own cattle, which is the most important. Again, that's the way how to measure basically wealth and social status. They take pride in various genealogies, and then we just have the rest of the population who are mostly farmers. And then there are some specialized professions, right? This is much more primitive society. This is something not at all like what these archaeological records and these written texts even show about the society in this period. Well, the problem is, of course, that this is just a complete argument from silence, right? Just because the Homeric epics don't mention these palaces and they don't mention these civil servants, that just doesn't mean that they existed, right? Um, so again, this objection is completely mute. That's just an argument from silence. And then, of course, an objection against the Homeric epics, and this is going to be the last objection that I want to make before moving to my closing statement, is that the gods in the Homeric epics are depicted how the gods would never behave. In the Homeric epics, gods are in discord. There is hatred among them. There is fighting. They are wounded in battles. They bleed. Aphrodite, for example, bleeds Ictor, the divine blood, right? Celestial blood. And of course, towards the end of the Iliad, the gods fight themselves, fight kind of amongst each other, right? And they even cuss them like each other out. So in Song 21, we have a duel, a combat between Hera and Artemis, and Hera basically says, "Bold vixen," she cried. And by the way, this is kind of very euphemistic translation because the Greek expression is a expression for a female dog. Dogs, of course, in antiquity, unlike today, was mostly perceived in a negative light, right? They were not these like adorable pets. They had very negative connotation, kind of how dogs are perceived, for example, in the Arab world today, right? Like when you tell someone he's a dog, it's an insult, a relatively serious one, right? So, for example, my Czech translation of the Iliad uses the word chupka, which means a bitch. And it's in Czech, it has as strong negative connotation as the word bitch has in English, right? So, bitch, she cried, how dare you cross me thus? For all you bow, you will find it hard to hold your own against me. Zeus made you as a lion among women and lets you kill them whenever you choose. And a little bit later, Hera caught both Artemis's wrists with her left hand as she spoke, and with her right she took the bow from her shoulders and laughed as she beat her with it and about the ears, while Artemis wriggled and writhed under her blows. So some might say this is a behavior that's completely inappropriate for the gods. Not only they are in discord, they are fighting each other, they are cussing each other out, and they are even smacking each other across the face. Well, this is just, again, amazing evidence for historical accuracy because this is massively embarrassing, you know? Nobody in their right mind would depict the gods as behaving this way unless it was actually the case. If this was really a fictional story made up by Homer, nobody would make up this, right? The gods are blessed, they are perfect beings, they are all loving, all merciful. So depicting them behaving this way is, of course, just best explained, but that actually happening and that information being divinely inspired by the muses. But then, of course, we have to ask the question if this is really what happened, because Homeric epics are historically inerrant. Why is it the case that that happened? Doesn't that contradict the very divine nature of the gods? Well, that we of course have to realize that just because we can't imagine the reason that would lead the gods into behaving this way, that doesn't mean that there was no reason. Surely the gods had morally sufficient reasons for behaving that way on that particular occasion, right? And just because we don't have epistemic access to them, just because the gods decided not to reveal those reasons for their actions to us, doesn't mean that they didn't have any. And there is a lot of plausible theodicies that we can put forward for why the gods behave that way. One of them is soul building. Surely, if you think about it, the entire Trojan War and all of the events were orchestrated by the gods to give the opportunity for the heroes and for their soul building, basically better themselves in their virtues, such as courage on the battlefield, so that they can pass to and live in the fields of Elysium. And of course, one of the reasons is for the story to be told, so that we can draw inspiration from it today. So that was the last objection that skeptics yield against the historical inerrancy of the Homeric epics. And I've just shown you guys how all of those reasons can actually be very easily dealt with. Which brings me to my closing statement, and then we can look at the chat again. So we were talking about specifically the Homeric epics, but it's actually important to realize that the discussion that we had today is a discussion between two worldviews, the pagan worldview and the atheistic worldview. And I think it's only fair if we take a little bit of time to compare the two worldviews. If atheism is true, then our life is our lives, and everything that we do is ultimately meaningless because the universe is heading towards a heat death. In a couple of billions of years, the Earth is going to be gone, and every last remnant, every last piece of evidence that humanity was even here in the first place is going to be destroyed. And then it's going to be just eternity of particles bumping into each other randomly, if even that. And really, in this great scope of things, our lives have absolutely no meaning. They have no purpose. They have no ultimate significance. What's more important is that if there are no gods, then our moral actions are completely unjustified. We can be moral, we can kind of play this game, we could act out these moral roles, we can pretend that we have objective moral obligations. But on the atheistic worldview, this isn't even the case. So what's the point? Let's just drink, sing, and be merry, because tomorrow we'll die. That's just a very bleak view of the world. And let's just compare it with a pagan worldview and all of the joy and all of the glory that it offers. On the pagan worldview, uh, not only is there ultimate purpose for human existence, not only is there ultimate meaning, and there is hope for the future, um, it actually grants even objective morality, and it can be only grounded on the pagan worldview. We all know that Zeus is all loving. He is actually the source, the origin of justice, peace, love, beauty, joy. All of those goddesses are daughters of Zeus. Without Zeus being their father, fathering them, they wouldn't exist. There would be no peace in this world. There would be no justice in this world. There would be only what was the case before Zeus took reign over the world. There would just be chaos, monsters, and evil ruling over us. Not only is Zeus all loving, he's even all merciful. Now, you might think, okay, this makes sense, but I'm just such a sinner, and I've been sinning against the gods my entire life. Surely there must be too late for me to repent. Well, let me tell you that no one is beyond the redemption. And we can even see that. We can see the ultimate example of Zeus' mercy when he actually forgave his own father. His father Kronos was, of course, horrible monster. He wanted to prevent uh, his son from being born so that he could secure the reign over the universe forever and prevent his son from dethroning him. And he did that in the most horrific way possible. He actually ate, he cannibalized all of his children, both sons and daughters, as soon as they were born. He even cannibalized his daughters, even though he knew that the god that's supposed to threaten him will be a son. Just ate them alive. And later, of course, he was defeated by Zeus. He was made to divulge all of the vomit basically out, all of the gods, Zeus's own siblings, out, alive, luckily. And he was imprisoned by Zeus in Tartarus. But then Zeus, despite all of these horrible atrocities, took pity on him and he forgave him. He let him out of Tartarus, and not only did he forgive him, he made him a king in Elysium, where the heroes live in the afterlife. In the Blessed Isles, where there is no death, no destruction, and there is only eternal peace. So if your sins are any less serious than cannibalizing your own children, Zeus can forgive you as well. And really, apart from justice and love and peace, there is so much that we owe to the gods. There is so much they have given us, either themselves or the heroes that they sent into the world. The things that just surround us and we don't even think about it today, things like farming, animal husbandry, shipbuilding and ship sailing, writing, poetry, art, music, and all other sciences, all other crafts, the ability to divine human will, all of these were first introduced to human society either by the gods or by the heroes. But let's not just think about this world, about how much joy and happiness and how much comfort the gods are bringing us. Because, of course, that is the next life after this one. And we should be thinking about it. And the images of the people who missed out on salvation in this world are very, very bleak. An old man knitting a rope in perpetuity, never ending. A group of women pouring water into amphoras, never to fill them. These are not tortures. People are not eternally tormented in Hades. There are some, but they offended the gods so much that they actually deserve these punishments. But what just normal people, normal sinners experience in Hades is not torment, is this sense of perpetual pointlessness and the feeling of being unfulfilled. The ultimate punishment is not having your telos, your ultimate goal, met. But if we actually do accept the gods in this life, and we do actually become initiated into their mysteries, there is eternal joy and bliss in the afterlife, as we read, for example, in Euripides and Aristophanes. And this is not only about joining the community of your own city together with the gods. It's not only in participating in the communal cult. It's also about joining the gods in a personal relationship with them. Uh, you can be joined with Bacchus in a divine marriage, for example. You can reach personal salvation for your soul, not only granting you benefits in this life, but also granting you salvation in the next one. So that was the presentation. Now I need to step out of the apologist mindset, step out of that role. And that's it, basically. This is how you defend historical inerrancy of the Homeric epics. And of course, the point of the video is to show you that anyone can do it with everything, right? It's not very difficult. I didn't prepare for it. That's hard. And if I actually put some thought into it, I'm sure it could be even better, right? Like the closing statement, I basically completely improvised based on some of the closing closing statements that I've watched in some debates about atheism and theism and stuff like that. I'm sure you've guys seen them as well. Just imagine if it just happened to be the case that some version of the traditional, Greco-Roman religion was the one that became popular, that won out over Christianity. And imagine if there were actually apologists who would spend centuries perfecting the arguments, perfecting the rhetoric, and having their ministries, having their YouTube channels, having money, having resources poured into this. Imagine if there were entire departments and entire universities even training these people. Imagine how much better it would be than what I can do now with basically no preparation, just on the spot. So yeah, it really makes you think, and it really makes puts things into perspective. I don't, of course, have to even do this because the outsider test of faith is enough. The various religions are their worst enemy, so to speak, because it shows that you can employ very often these same lines of argumentation to defend various conflicting ideas. But just because I'm geeking about the ancient world, I wanted to show that you can do it even with something like the Homeric epics. And I'm just hope that nobody's going to find this video out of context, like one of my teachers, right? Because what I was just talking about was nuts. Again, I don't think that I said anything that would be factually inaccurate, that would be outright false. If yes, that wasn't the intention. It's just the kind of rhetorical strategies, again, oversimplifications, overgeneralizations, the false sense of confidence. It could not have been any other way than this. It's just lifted from apologetics. So yeah, next time there's going to be something normal, and I won't have to be role playing an apologist anymore. And by the way, I kept mentioning this is something that I should maybe talk a little bit about. I kept mentioning, Homer writing the epics, right? So that's one of a part of the apologetic shtick, right? So of course, in reality, the question, or the Homeric question, the question of authorship of the Homeric epics is massively complicated. It's massively debated. There are various camps, and you can find people all over the spectrum, ranging from, yes, there was this guy named Homer who actually composed an original work, uh, which in some way is connected with the text as we have it today. And it makes sense to talk about him as a historical figure, and it makes sense to talk about Iliad and the Odyssey as his own creation, as like a original composition. And the opposite extreme is, of course, that Homer never existed, and that the Iliad and the Odyssey, as we have them today, are a process of a are a product of a very long process of development. And there are, of course, scholars all over on that spectrum. What now, today, nobody denies, basically, and this has been the case since like 1920s, 1930s, is that before the Homeric epics, there must have been oral tradition, and that probably the Homeric epics are a very late stage in in this oral tradition, right? So they are the oldest text, Greek text that we have today, but they are certainly not the oldest thing that existed. They are actually at the end of a very long tradition, not in the middle, and definitely not at the beginning. And there are hypotheses that maybe Homer even is actually polemical. He's actually being subversive. He is not just repeating the tradition, he's actually changing it because he wants to say new things. Like there are, for example, people who think that Homer is essentially a pacifist. He has a very negative view of war, and they think this was subversive. That wasn't normally the case, right? But there is no way for us to know because Homer is the first thing that we have, and everything that came before is lost, probably forever, um, unless there is some amazing found archaeological. But that would be like the not that wouldn't be just an archaeological finding of a century. It would be a finding of like 1,000 years if we found something older than Homer, right? We of course have the late Bronze Age texts, but they are completely disconnected from all of the later ancient tradition. They are not only disconnected because it was a different culture, a different civilization. They are also disconnected in terms of content. They are not narratives. We don't have any myths. We don't have any epic poetry. We only have accounting, basically, accounting records. Um, there are no stories. We know the names of the gods, but we have nothing behind them, those names. There are, for example, names of the gods that only show up in these late Bronze Age tablets, and they are not attested later. They don't show up in Homer or anywhere else. And those gods are just going to be completely anonymous, probably forever. We will have no idea what those people imagined in those palaces about the gods. So, yeah. Some questions. Frozen Sea. Do you think apologetics only arise in belief systems that have a great commission to go make disciples of everyone? I don't think so. So apologetics, it seems to be, has always been around. And a couple of streams ago, I was talking about how a lot of the arguments in that are used in apologetics, like Christian apologetics today, are actually centuries old, and how you can see them already and you can find them already in ancient texts. And what's important is that they are deployed by proponents of various theological systems that are not evangelistic. So, Epicureans, Stoics, even skeptics already engaged in this kind of argumentation, and they employed some form of apologetic, some form of fine-tuning arguments, the problem of evil and the various theodicies, and these kinds of things. Even though the religious systems that these people subscribed to were not apologetic, were not evangelistic. So yeah, that's it. So now for something completely different. It's going to be short this time because we are already going again way over time. When I started streaming, I thought I would be going for an hour at most, but I don't mind. So there is something hilarious that I found in the Laws, which is a late Platonic dialogue. It's probably one of the last dialogues of Plato. It's called a dialogue, and it technically is, but it's actually almost a monologue, right? So there's just one character, the Athenian guest, who is just monologuing the entire time, and his conversational partners in the dialogue are not really there to disagree with him. They are there to say, "Oh yes, how wise! I agree." Who would not agree? Like these very formulaic expressions of agree. And basically, it's a textbook of how to design I wouldn't say ideal, but like the best possible polis. It's sometimes said, even though it's not really true, that in the Republic, um, Plato outlined the ideal, like the kind of best possible polis. And in the laws, he outlined the best, doable polis, the best polis that could actually exist in the real world. And the kind of framing from the dialogue is that in Crete, in the island of Crete, they want to establish a new colony, and they are thinking about how to design its constitution, its political system. So they are talking about it, and there is this guest who arrived to Crete, and he's basically giving his idea, his and he's just describing everything, like all the laws, all the institutions, and stuff like that. And there are some hilarious stuff. This specifically touches to probably my most favorite subject in the ancient world, and it's ancient medicine and ancient kind of ideas and conceptions of physiology, because they are absolutely hilarious in how completely misguided they are, right? Like one of the most hilarious things that you can find, at least it seems that way to me, is the Hippocratic corpus and the various Greek medical treatises, Galen, Aristotle, and stuff like that. Yeah, because they are, usually very practical advice, like how to do with what to do uh, in various when you're dealing with various diseases. And the advices, especially from our point of view, are like completely nuts. And so here's something that's kind of similar to that. And it's the idea that everyone knows that like exercise, moving around, running, jogging, and stuff like that is good for your health, right? Everyone understands that. And people in the ancient world understood it as well. So they obviously knew that people who move around a lot get physically stronger and that they get healthier. But the thing is that because they didn't understand the underlying processes, they concluded, at least it seems to be the case from this passage that Plato concluded, that it's not the physical exercise that makes you stronger, it's the movement itself. And that you can actually get stronger even if you are moved, for example, on a chariot, right? So as long as your body is like being displaced, as long as changing location in space, that's good for your health, uh, even though you're not doing anything yourself or you're not exercising, right? So here is what it says. But they are far from thinking that the training they give them by exciting their pugnacity provides sufficient exercise. In addition to this, by the way, he's talking about people who train birds to fight, right? So cockfighting, for example, he talks about it. So he's basically saying, look, it's not enough, it's not sufficient to just give them exercise. He says, in addition to this, each man takes up his bird and keeps it tucked away in his fist if it is small, or under his arm if it is large. And this way they walk many a long mile in order to improve the condition, not of their own bodies, but of those creatures. So again, here we have this idea that if you have a bird and you want it to be very strong so that it can fight, exercising it, it's not enough. You actually have to take it and you have to carry it and move it around. As it's being moved, it gets stronger. So it's not making yourself stronger, or at least it's not the point. The point is that just by the body being physically like move around in space, it's getting stronger. And then it goes on to say, Plato goes on to say, thus clearly do they show to any observant person that all bodies benefit as by a tonic when they are moved by any kind of shaking or motion, uh, whether they are moved by their own action, as in a swing or in a rowing boat, or are carried along on a horseback, or by any other rapidly moving bodies. So yeah, I find it really hilarious, this kind of idea that, and by the way, I haven't read any commentary or anything like that, so I don't know if this is a joke or anything, right? But it seems to me, just on his face, that this is what Plato believes, or he's at least like reproducing beliefs that people really had in the ancient world. And this wouldn't be anything implausible, because really, if you read this like medical treatises and what people thought about how the world works and how human bodies work, that's just completely nuts, right? So yeah, I just find it hilarious, this idea that, if you like think about the the flight attendants, they would just be ripped, right? Because they are just flying in the air all the time. It's like high speeds, so their muscles would be completely through the roof. Or think about the astronauts who are like orbiting the Earth in the space station, going what must be like, I don't know, thousands of kilometers per hour, right? What is it, 28,000 kilometers per hour, or something like that. Yeah, those must be amazing bodybuilders, right? Or like Formula One racers as well. So yeah, that's apparently a thing. So yeah, this is it. Thanks you guys for listening. And I already have a topic in mind for next week, next Wednesday. I'm not going to tell you though what it is because I'm not 100% sold. I'm actually talking about with Doug of the Pine Creek Doug's fame. I might even stream on his channel if he likes it. But I think this is really, really hilarious. It's essentially debunking of one specific argument that has to do with the historical reliability of the Gospels, and that's put forward by one specific New Testament scholar. So if it turns out promising, then this is what we are going to cover next week. So thanks for sticking around, and have a great rest of the week.